This video is a short introduction to making graphs. It will explain the essential elements of a graph and provide some formatting tips. Section 1. Essential elements of a graph. A y-axis. This is the vertical axis. Typically, you would plot your dependent variable on this axis. The dependent variable is what is being measured. For example, height, temperature, length, or counts. An x-axis. This is the horizontal axis. Typically, you would plot your independent variable on this axis. The independent variable is the reason for the variation. Commonly, time will be along the x-axis or the categories of your experiment. We also need to include labels for each axis so readers can interpret the graph. For example, in this graph we are measuring the growth of a plant over time. Therefore, the height of the plant is the dependent variable and will go on the y-axis. On the y-axis we will write the label as height and in brackets, centimetres. Time is the independent variable, so that goes on the x-axis. On the x-axis we would write the time and in brackets, days. This includes the unit of measure being days. If you were running a shorter experiment, time could be measured in seconds, minutes, or hours, or even years for a long experiment. This is why it is important to include the unit of measure in the axis label. We also need to include tick marks and tick labels on the axes. Along the x-axis we will write 1 to 5, and given the label, this means 5 days. On the y-axis we will write 1 to 10 to measure the height of the plants in centimetres. It is important to know the data points you want to plot before setting your scale. If you have more than one data series on your graph, for example, you are measuring the growth of 2 plants, you will need to include a legend so readers can easily identify the data. Make sure you use different shapes as well as colours in case it is printed in black and white. Finally, we must include a title for our graph. Make sure you write something descriptive, and if you have multiple graphs in your assignment, make sure you label with numbers so you can easily refer to the right graph in your text. For example, Graph 1, growth of cress over 1 week. Section 2, formatting tips. Tip 1. Make sure you fill your graph space with your data points. This is to make sure your data doesn't clump into one area of the graph, leaving lots of white space. For example, you can start your y-axis at 60 instead of 0. You can see when we start the axis at 60, the data points spread out across the graph, reducing the unused space and making it easier to read. If you don't start your axis at 0, make sure you include a break so it's obvious to the reader. For some graphs, you have to start the axis at 0, so think about your scale you use on the axis to maximise the use of space. Choose the correct unit of measure. For example, by using millilitres on this scale, we have lots of zeros written on the axis. If we change the scale to litres, we can change 1000 to 1 and so on to make the scale easier to read. You don't need to include grid lines running across the graph. This can make the graph look cluttered and hard to read. Instead, use tick marks on the axes. You don't need to include lots of tick marks. For example, major tick marks could be every 10 units, with a minor tick mark at every 5 units, rather than a tick mark at every single unit. A final tip. Don't change your scale along an axis. Keep it consistent, and by looking carefully at your data before you start plotting, you should be able to pick a scale to fit your data neatly onto the graph. This video was brought to you by Study Smarter UWA. For more videos, subscribe to our channel or visit studysmarter.uwa.edu.au.